Well, hello everyone. My name is Christine Lemmer-Webber. This talk is Fun, the Fediverse and Spritely, a positive future for an era of crisis. I'm glad to be here at FediForum 2025. So about me, I'm Christine Lemmer-Webber. I've already said that, and it's been already introduced as such. I'm the executive director of the Spritely Institute. Um, and you might also know me as co-author of ActivityPub, of course. If you're here, you probably do. Um, but just a short word about the Spritely Institute. We have the Spritely as a project, but we also have Spritely the Institute, which is a 501c3 nonprofit in the U.S. It's a decentralization research institute. We are building tech that makes secure distributed programming easy. That is the goal, and to try to kind of level up the world of decentralized networking. But of course, I already said, what I'm probably known for here is ActivityPub. And I think there's, when you give a talk like this, it's an opportunity to reflect. ActivityPub has been very successful in that there's the whole Fediverse is running on it generally, and that's great, right? We have when at the start of the process, it wasn't always clear that that was going to be the case. So I don't think I need to spend much time at this particular conference explaining what ActivityPub is. So instead, I want to talk about conversations I no longer have, because this used to be a lot of what would happen when I would try to talk to nearly anybody. Is explain what is a decentralized social network. Well, some to some degree that conversation happens, but in technical circles, almost none at all. And actually, when starting to work on ActivityPub, it was very difficult to get many people to believe that you could even build a decentralized social network, that such a concept could exist. Um, and even though we had examples of it in practice, but the general problem was at the time of standardizing ActivityPub is that there wasn't a unified form of federated standards, right? There were actually many different decentralized social network softwares that existed at the time, and by and large could not talk to each other. So building a unified standard to be able to get them all to talk to each other was a it was a big effort that was important, but it was also an effort that was difficult at one point to convince people was worthwhile, and I think isn't today. So I think these are successes. And I'm going to say that ActivityPub is the most successful decentralized social protocol on the merits of decentralization at this moment, right? In terms of number of implementations that have implemented ActivityPub and number of servers that are actually talking to each other using ActivityPub, and by the ratio of users distributed across servers, it's most successful in those regards. But of course, also Bluesky and AT now exist and are much larger in terms of user count, right? And I think that a lot of times when we end up getting into spaces talking about the Fediverse and about Bluesky and stuff like that, a lot of these things can end up being in kind of butting heads directions. And I don't actually um, think that that's that productive, and maybe that's a surprise. You may have seen this article that I wrote hit a bunch of social media areas. I see Brian Newbold's here. Actually, the follow up article to this ended up being kind of a back and forth between the two of us. But I believe in trying to be actually have real constructive and positive conversation between these different spaces is the best way that we can move forward for everyone. And this article kind of talked about the issues that I saw with Bluesky being decentralized, and I think these still exist, though I think that there are improvements happening. We are seeing more efforts in the Bluesky space towards actually implementing people running more of the infrastructure, which is good. It doesn't resolve all of the concerns that I raised in my post, but I also don't think that I really want to spend a lot of time talking about those concerns in great detail here. I do want to talk about what these kind of two spaces can learn from each other very briefly, though. So here's what I think Bluesky can learn from ActivityPub. I think we have a much wider deployment in terms of the number of servers out there and so on and so forth. We have a much more diverse set of implementations across different programming languages, across both client and server, and so on and so forth. Well, actually, I'll say across server, because the client server spec of ActivityPub didn't really get it that broadly implemented. But and we also have protocol standardization built on consensus process, right? I think it's easy to forget that ActivityPub happened in a consensus process in a standards group. It was not just one large player. It was actually bringing together a wide variety of different participants to find out what the right thing was to build and to standardize upon it. We've done, I think, very strongly on terms of scaling down and scaling wide. And I think with the final thing, I say message passing. If you read my article about the shared heap versus message passing, one of the reasons that I kind of emphasize that I think AT Proto has a challenge in terms of scaling is that it doesn't do addressing, which can mean it's difficult to know who to send messages to, which means that you end up in this quadratic scaling problem that I don't want to go into detail, and you can read all that more there. But I think that actually it's very likely that we'll see AT Proto address this type of thing. Brian Newbold hinted that that was a possibility in his follow-up post to my first post, and I think that that is a possibility that we could end up seeing, which could end up actually making it so that that current concern ends up being addressed. And let's talk about what ActivityPub can learn from Blue Sky. So this is something I've actually long believed is really important, is that Blue Sky has content addressing. I wrote a demo in very early days of ActivityPub showing off how to do content addressing so that servers could go down and content could survive. Portable identity, I think, is also really important. And also having a lot more resources makes it a lot easier to be able to make progress a lot faster, I suppose. Um, but that's not an area I want to focus on here either. Um, and I'm going to bring this up, and I not for the reason that you might initially see me bring it up, as in terms of like, Jay and I wrote this thing together, and this is what should have happened. Actually, the opposite. Jay and I wrote a proposal in the Blue Sky process, talking about a path forward by which ActivityPub could end up being evolved to being what I think a more robust future of things, and I think this still holds up. So there's a if you go searching for this name, you'll find the document. And it's the post that we made in 2020 before Blue Sky as an organization existed. And I think that I'm highlighting it actually is if you want to see the Christine view of how to upgrade the upgrade path for ActivityPub, I think this is actually it. And the other reason I highlight it is that at the time that this conversation happened, um, a lot of these ideas were being explored in Spritely, and one of the conversations between Jay and I then at that time was that, well, we were working on a lot more experimental and research side of things, and Blue Sky was going to focus on trying to be able to scale to a wider audience much faster. And I think that that's a legitimate choice to make. And so I'm not actually highlighting this as division. I'm highlighting this as in terms of there actually are paths towards being able to build, I think, future-facing versions of things, and conversations do happen between different spaces. But I'm going to make it a bold assertion, which is that we've largely been chasing things from the aughts and the 2010s in terms of styles of social media software, and I don't think that's longer enough. This is true across both Blue Sky and the Fediverse. I think we're very caught in this vision of social media that was defined by a few large corporations that had their 20 heyday in the 2010s, but of course started in the kind of early 2000s or mid 2000s, but um, I'm particularly concerned about activism and surveillance. Social media has been critical to activism over the last several, like decade and a half, or even 2 decades, maybe at this point. There have been lots of important um, um, movements that have really organized around it, like Black Lives Matter, so on and so forth. And I remember when Blue Sky was first kind of starting to appear, and a lot of people were doing this Twitter migration. You were seeing a lot of posts that was like, "This is so great! It's like Twitter, but without all the things that are bad about." It. And then Interpol joined and made this post: "Does this platform need policing?" And then the replies to it at the time were a bunch of people being like, "What? Like this shouldn't be possible here. How is this possible?" Right? And of course, the reality is that all of the structures of our types of media, not just Blue Sky, but are actually very very well set up for broad surveillance, right? And And the surveillance level of things is something I think we should be taking very seriously, right? We have multiple of the largest companies rising on the stock market are prison companies and surveillance companies are skyrocketing since the beginning of the Trump administration. And the and in terms of like kind of like the combination of like the surveillance industrial and state complexes, this is something that I think we should be thinking about. Are we providing the platforms by which are necessary for organization, that are necessary for the survival of communities in the rise of global fascism? Um, Now, I will hint one more thing on terms of AT Proto, but this is not actually just specific to AT Proto. Is that AT Proto's infrastructure is entirely based around the idea of having a global public, kind of bucket of content that's encouraged to be indexed, right? If you read the AT Proto paper, it encourages public indexing as the primary mechanism by which it exists, and they do this for several reasons. One of which is, trying to be able to make sure that that people can pull off an algorithmic feed that is interesting, but still while still having a diversity of algorithmic feed choices. But I think that we should be really concerned about this. I don't think that users quite understand, by and large, what they're being subjected to. And I think that to some degree, we are seeing some understanding of that as things have been moving more and more towards private spaces. The Fediverse isn't much better in this regard, actually. The Fediverse, by and large, is highly indexable. It might not be built around a protocol of indexing, and it may have some addressing mechanisms which do not include public indexing. However, by and large, it isn't that much better. ActivityPub was not built actually to be a public first protocol in some ways. It's more like email. If everybody says, what's ActivityPub? It's like email, right? And it is in many ways, and actually the exception is public. But nonetheless, the Fediverse, as it's rolled out, has rolled out to a very kind of like miming the world of a Twitter-like network, and thus it is largely public by default, even though it does follow some mechanisms that could be different than that. And ultimately, what this really results in is there's a big contrast between the world in Blue Sky, where indexing is strongly encouraged, at least from the architectural point of view. Sometimes users get very upset about it, but from the architectural point of view, it's strongly encouraged. Versus on the Fediverse, where indexing is actually strongly opposed. But nonetheless, I think it's really important. One of the phrases that I like to repeat is, we must not pretend that we can prevent what we cannot. And it's important to realize that a lot of the anti-indexing perspectives on the Fediverse are norms, right? They are conventions that we would like people to abide by. And a lot of these resemble robots.txt on websites, right? Please don't index these particular things. And by and large, website administrators understand that robots.txt can and often is ignored, and actually just um, that it's the goodwill of people that prevents things from being ignored, which is disappearing noticeably in the age of AI scrapers. I think it's important to understand what it is that we're providing for users. How do we move forward? If we're not building tools that are sufficiently um, protective towards activists, towards vulnerable communities, towards etc., how do we end up moving to a safer place? How can we help people be safe? I don't think we can do it just by building tools that we shame people into using. Say, eat your security vegetables, right? If shame was good enough, everybody would have be using email and PGP. It would have won, right? Everybody would be using it today. It's the uh, apparently healthy thing to do for email communication, and yet it hasn't succeeded, right? Yes, you and a few of your friends who commit to a few free and open source software Linux distributions may actually use email and PGP, but by large, the world has not adopted it, right? We have to think stronger than this. What's been interesting, though, is that we have seen widespread adoption of private communication, and we've seen it through Signal, right, and a few other places like it. But Signal has been kind of the big breakthrough point. And I have my own criticisms of Signal. Signal is centralized. It's not really possible to be able to run your own Signal stuff and et cetera, et cetera. But it's noticeable that Signal is something that has managed to reach a lot of people, right? Many people use Signal, and they manage to have end-to-end encrypted communication every day. And it's possible, it's to the degree where many people actually, their default is to speak over Signal, whether or not they even realize that they're doing that for privacy purposes. They may just have had family and friends that have asked, hey, could you message me over Signal? It's my preferred way to chat. And another interesting thing about Signal is that, more and more articles are coming out about this. Lots and lots of communication and activist organizing is happening over Signal, right? It's not necessarily the tool that you would want to use for activist organizing, and yet it is the tool that's available, and it is the tool that's reaching people for such things. Now, in terms of the Fediverse, a few years ago, I started writing an article that tried to explain my vision of where I thought things should go. And the article, it lays out the problems very thoroughly, but kind of stops as it starts to explain the solutions. And there's a reason for that. The article is called OCAP Pub Towards Networks of Consent. I was kind of preparing it in the era, preparing for when we were giving the first ActivityPub conference, ActivityPub Conf 2019. And I kind of was like, oh, like here's how we can fix a lot of these things. Here's kind of where I was hoping things would go with ActivityPub. And one of the things I really liked about ActivityPub was that it followed the actor model, which is not important to go through here, but does have implications as in terms of what's possible. And this, I was trying to lay out this vision called networks of consent. And when I spent time talking to a bunch of Fediverse implementers, what they said was, "This article sounds great, but I don't think we can probably implement it, right? How do we do these types of flows that you're talking about in a Ruby on Rails application, right?" And this was actually a good point. The vision that I was describing um, didn't necessarily look like something you would get using a Web 2.0 style framework, or at least it was something that was hard to think about using that type of framework. It might be easier with Erlang or something like that, and we do have one prominent Erlang/Elixir implementation, but nonetheless, um, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the Web 2.0 development world, which is really where I cut my teeth as a developer, right? So I really for a decade or so, actually identified as a Python web developer, right? So I spent a lot more time in the Django community, but the Rails community is Rails as a framework is really where the Web 2.0 took off. And what's interesting about kind of Rails and Django and et cetera is that they didn't just teach you to write Web 2.0 applications. They did that. Um, and they didn't just provide the infrastructure for it. They taught you to think like a Web 2.0 developer, right? It was hard to do anything else but be a Web 2.0 developer with these types of systems. And I think this is worthy of praise, is in terms of this is an example of where we put together a framework that changes the default. It changes the default of how people start to think about and develop things. But the defaults that are encoded are often defaults that capture the worldview of those who are producing and shipping them. So in particular, there's this phrase on this page that says Ruby on Rails scales from hello world to IPO. There is a value that is encoded right on this page, and that is the idea that the people who are adopting it are planning on trying to raise money to be able to, like get an evaluation, right? To be able to kind of get rich in this kind of like very, like venture capital type way, right? Um, and in fact, almost, the interesting thing about the Web 2.0 era was that it was a pivot from where I think many people thought the networks were going to go at the time, which was that things were going to go in a much more peer-to-peer direction, right? When there was this direction of real enthusiasm for like, oh, we're going to have these kind of peer-to-peer technologies where people can connect and everything directly together. And what happened with Web 2.0 was that it became kind of like instead actually the strong centralization of client server stuff, and that this was an opportunity to kind of capture things. And in many ways, the Fediverse was a response to that. I know Evan Prodromos in the chat. Evan was very active actually in something called the Franklin Street Statement, which was trying to address this. Um, and so I think that one interesting thing that's a continued artifact of this is that um, it's very difficult as we've been building our stuff on top of this infrastructure. We face the difficulties of the values that are encoded in the world that was built in the Web 2.0 era. Deployment moved towards something of DevOps, and DevOps inherently was about deployment teams of paid developers working for corporations that are planning on having some sort of valuation and have teams that can actually cash in on this. This has really harmed the world of self-hosting, right? Things we are using tools that were not designed for self-hosting, that did not think from first principles what would happen if we wanted to develop and move towards self-hosting. They were not built around free software principles. They were not built around the idea of um, shipping source code being the most important thing, right? You're delivering a product. Can we change the defaults? Right? Can we build and envision a different era for things? I think we can. So I mentioned that I am the executive director of the Spritely Institute. And if you go to spritely.institute, you'll find both the home of Spritely, the nonprofit, but you'll also find Spritely, this category of software and efforts that we're doing to be able to change things. Spritely is an attempt to build, not just an attempt, it's an active effort to build the next generation of decentralized networking technology and to rethink things. Spritely started basically as ActivityPub came to a close in its standardization effort. The question that I had of what can't we do? What do we need to do next? Right? And ActivityPub has many different components. And each one of the characters that you see, if you go to the original Spritely website, we've refactored it since, but the original Spritely website had all these different characters in it, and sometimes people said it was a little bit confusing, like reading a D&D monster manual. There were all these different pieces, and um, what's interesting is that outline of what we needed to do has actually remained fairly true. I'm not going to focus on it in this talk. I'll talk about a couple of components. But what actually was also true about having all these different characters is that all these characters that represented the different components have were also had these characters associated with them, and this artwork was co-developed between myself and fantasy artist and well-known Creative Commons community member David Revoix, who also makes the comic Pepper and Carrot and has done artwork for some of the major Blender movies. So we designed these characters together, and one of the reasons for that is that we wanted to actually set a different framing around secure technology. We didn't want it to be I'm the hardcore hacksaw going to DEF CON, I'm putting up my hoodie and I'm breaking into systems and I'm blah, blah, blah. And like, I'm the cool kid who can use all this technology. We actually wanted things to be really friendly and accessible. And so there was an intentional attempt to be able to try to make things somewhat whimsical and friendly and inviting. And two of the major components of Spritely that I am going to talk about here is Goblins, which is our distributed programming environment, and Hoot, which is our schemed WebAssembly compiler, which allows our tech to be accessible on the web. The important thing here to understand is that we have Goblins as our framework, which allows you to write code, which then works in a peer-to-peer network. Without you having to think about it much, the same way that Django and Rails allowed you to be able to write code and be able to build a Web 2.0 application, that was the default thing you got. Peer-to-peer secure web applications are the default thing you get with Goblins. But making them available to people means getting them on the web, and that's hence our Hoot mascot here. And here, this was from our release announcement when they finally you could finally connect them together, and we were so excited that you could use them. And so they're going on an adventure together, right? One of the other important components, and here you might go, oh no, is Christine replacing ActivityPub? That's not it. But I want to talk about OCAPN, the Object Capability Network. When you program a Goblins application, by default, you end up getting a secure peer-to-peer based application. And part of the reason that that's the case is that you can focus on the code and not on the network. And yet here you're seeing a very complicated looking network diagram. This is actually a technical diagram we made for ourselves to be able to understand one of the more complicated technical flows that's happening inside of the OCAPN protocol. The particular details of this flow is not important for this particular presentation, but what you can see is that there's some complicated machinery going on. One of the goals that we had was that you did not have to understand the machinery, right? The same way that a developer picking up and using a Web 2.0 application might actually be using an ORM, maybe otherwise initially unfamiliar with kind of designing a database and be otherwise unfamiliar with, a lot of things. They get guided through the process. In Spritely's technology, we're focusing on peer-to-peer applications where you can write distributed code and not actually have to focus on the details of how to be able to build a secure peer-to-peer layer. We've done that for you. And it might just be easier to actually show you some of this stuff because if I tell you that we're building, we've got Goblins, which is a distributed transactional programming environment that has time travel debugging. It's over peer-to-peer networks. It's written in Scheme. It's blah blah blah, and like all this stuff. We've got encrypted portable storage and all these different components. It sounds overwhelming, right? And sometimes people can tune out, right? Um, so one of the things, and this has actually been very inspired by watching the Blender world, which has had a lot of success by doing these open movie projects where they make developers and also artists sit down next to each other to publish movies that then advance the software. Spritely is very focused on developing demos at every stage of the process so that you can see that the technology actually works, and so that you can actually even play with it yourself. We've done a lot of these demos. I'm going to just show a few of them. Um, the first one I'm going to do is actually not a game. It's just a very it's just from this blog post itself. So if you go to spritely.institute and you go to the news and scroll down, you'll see this thing that announced Goblins in the browser. Now, on this page, you'll see this GIF, which was from very early on in the development of OCAPN. What you're seeing here is a peer-to-peer protocol. OCAPN can run over multiple message substrates, including Tor Onion services. If anonymity is important to you, we have several other paths that are faster than Tor Onion services. But what's interesting about this demo is that this is only 150 lines of code for both the chat room and also the user code on the back end. Only 150 lines. And yet it verifies that each message is coming from the respective user. Neither the chat room nor the other users can fake messages coming from each other. And we see here two different implementations across two different programming languages talking to each other. There's a Racket version at the bottom and a Guile version at the top, and yet they're able to speak to each other. This 150 line chat program that I wrote as an example early days of OCAPN has kind of carried forward at various times. We actually use a variant of this for internal communication at Spritely every day. But you can actually try it yourself. If you go on this blog post right here on the page, you see peer A, peer B, and we can say, hey, what's up? And it appears down here on peer B, and you can say, how's it going? And it appears up here. Now this is running a simulated protocol so that it can run statically on this page even if your network connection goes offline, but it's actually exactly the same protocol that you see happening up here over Tor Onion services. This is a thing that exists. This is not theoretical. You just saw it in action. This is real stuff. Okay. So the first program that I wrote in Goblins to be able to make sure things worked was this thing called Terminal Space. You can play this. It's a space shooter that runs in your terminal. It's ASCII art, except for the stars in the background. Those use Braille characters so that I would have higher resolution for the parallax star field. But anyway, this was actually a demo program just to be able to say, does Goblins actually work? Is this comfortable to program in? And is it fast enough? And as you can see, it's plenty fast. This is despite having time travel, despite being transactional, despite being decentralized. It's not using a blockchain. It's not doing any of those types of things. It's fast. You can do something real time. You can make a video game out of it, right? And developing this allowed me to be able to make sure that the ergonomics of the system were comfortable enough that you could do something like this. So as I said, from the very beginning of Spritely, developing demos has been really key and essential. And actually, one of the other things that came out of this was that I realized, oh my gosh, actually, we have time travel. Right? Here you see moving backwards and forwards in time. The interesting thing about this is that I didn't even think about time travel being possible while developing a game. Not a single line of gameplay code actually refers to time travel being something that exists. It's just that it was something like, oh yeah, we have transactionality, therefore we have time travel. I should just show it off. And so about half an hour to an hour, I added the GUI that lets you explore the time travel, but there was no gameplay code changes at all. That's because the same way that you focus on the code without mentioning the network, and you're able to get secure distributed code, you can focus on the code and not think about time travel, and yet you get time travel for free. Now I'm going to show you a puzzle game that we did for the List Game Jam. We love doing these game jams. You'll probably enjoy it yourself. If you go to spritely.institute/arcade, you can find it in the menu at the top. You can find this yourself. But I'm going to play it on itch.io where we initially published it. Here, you're this little owl exploring this, basically exploring this haunted lab. and you're trying to solve puzzles, right? And it's kind of like Sokoban if you've played that type of thing. But here I'm going to make a mistake. Oh, I opened this gate. Now I can't get through anymore. What can I do? Well, I can rewind time, and now, aha, now I can get through the gate. Now, the more you start to play this, you start to this is not only a block pusher game, it combines it with a cellular automata named Wire World, where you build circuits to be able to solve puzzles. And so, for example, in this one, we have to be able to make the cat happy. And later on, we need to actually build the circuits ourselves. The details of this are not important. The more important thing is this undo key. The reason that we built this was to show off, this was our first demo of Goblins working live in the browser, of Goblins and Hoot combined, right? This is a demo of the two concepts actually coming together. Now, the reason I'm showing this to you, the reason why this is important is not just that it's fun, although I will emphasize in a moment why I think fun is actually critical to our success. It's actually to show you that these things that we've been talking about in Spritely are not theoretical. This is real software that works in real time that you can use today. It is futuristic feeling because you won't see the technology that we're showing here in nearly any other software that exists, but it is stuff that is real. All right. You can play the rest of the game yourself. If you manage to collect all the gems, please let me know. I'd be very happy. The puzzles towards the end get a little bit insidious. Anyway, so here's a video from one of our most recent demos, actually. We just had another game jam, and we just put out this demo. And what this one is it's actually a little virtual world where you can farm with your friends. This was written in less than a week using our technology. Once again, this program was written initially as an offline program, and then it was hooked up to OCAPN, and a lot of the network stuff actually came for free. This is showing off that OCAP and the network protocol that we're talking about is not only something that you can use, but actually it's real time enough that you can even build a real time game with it, right? Now, why am I showing this to you? I'm showing it to you for a few reasons. One of them is when I say that we can rethink what our software can be, I mean we can really rethink what our software can be. Why can't all software be social, right? Not just games, right? Once something becomes possible to do interactive and collaborative and networked, it's actually very difficult to convince people to have it any other way. It's, one LibreOffice is now exploring real-time collaboration, but for a while there, once Google Office became available, it was difficult even to get my free software friends to use anything other than Google Docs because the advantages of being able to do real-time collaboration are so strong. Why can't all software be social? Why are we only denigrating a few things as being social? And in fact, when it comes to the topic of activism, it is essential that all pieces of software that we consider in our chain to be able to be collaborative, to be able to be social, to be able to be secure. If we don't have security at every layer, we are leaving vulnerable people vulnerable in ways that they may not even realize. But the other reason that I'm showing you this is that it's fun. Fun is really important. We cannot succeed without joy. Joy is the reason that all social networks have managed to gain their success, including the Fediverse, to the degree that they have today. People posting their lunch, people talking to their friends, etc. Those are the things that allowed Twitter to succeed, to grow to the degree that it did, so that it was available to be used as a tool for Black Lives Matter, for instance. The Fediverse grew for communities on Twitter that were finding themselves not experiencing joy, right? During this kind of like second or perhaps third era of the Fediverse, when ActivityPub was really growing and when Mastodon was taking off. It really grew because of a lot of queer communities on the Fediverse finding that their needs were not being met on Twitter, and they decided to create spaces for themselves where they could experience joy with their friends. Joy and community building are essential to our success. We have to think about fun in order to be able to succeed. We can't just get people to eat their security vegetables. We won't succeed in that case. Now, I asked some people on the Fediverse to provide pictures of themselves at Pride, so I'm going to show a few of them here. But I'm going to end with this image. When I first transitioned, I actually did not go to Pride for a few years because I felt a little bit embarrassed, like, like, oh well, I, maybe it's imposter syndrome about being queer, really. But I started going over the last couple years, and I'm really glad I did. And one of the other things that I felt initially was, well, this is just, it's just awesome. Am I just making a big deal about myself? Like we're just having fun and like all this stuff. And then, but today Pride feels very different, right? It feels a return to its origins as rebellion, right? And that rebellion is inherently tied to joy. The initial riots that occurred both at Stonewall, but also in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, and so on and so forth, these were about people in their communities that were building communities for themselves that were then forbidden, that were actively interrogated, that were harassed by police, and them fighting back, and then building spaces of joy for themselves, right? Preserving the spaces they had of joy and growing them further. We cannot succeed without joy, and we cannot succeed without building spaces in which activists can be safe. I encourage you to think about the tools that we are building today, the degree to which they help people be able to grow, to be able to fulfill their needs, the ways in which they help people be safe, and the ways in which they may not be helping people safe in ways that they may not realize, and how we can get to those better places. That's what I'm really concerned about today. So I'm just going to say thank you. As I said, I'm Christine Lemmer-Webber. I'm from the Spritely Institute. I'm also from ActivityPub, and I'm also from the Fediverse, of course. Um, what we really want to do is to build a world together. I encourage you to visit Spritely.institute if you find this stuff really compelling. We are a nonprofit. We are funded by people like you. Please donate. It makes a huge difference, actually. And also, you get to appear in the credits of some of those video games you saw. But other than that, I'm just going to stop here and say thanks. Let's build communities together.